Welcome, everyone. My name is Susan Banky, and I am on the executive committee of the Sydney Southeast Asia Center, and I am also the director of the Master of Social Justice, both of these at the University of Sydney. I am mindful that in a webinar format, sometimes it's hard to know whether people join immediately on time or not. And so generally my inclination is to give a few minutes to start. However, we are quite pressed for time. This is just a 1-hour lunch webinar, and I do want to make sure that we pack it in with as much information and talking as possible. So I will move forward. I want to thank you for coming. I see that we already have over 100 audience members, and I am grateful that you are here with us. I want to start by acknowledging the country on which I currently am, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I am grateful as ever for their custodianship of this land. They have protected it far better than the white people that followed. I hope that custodianship continues, and with great respect, I acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging that come from those lands. And I invite you all in your minds to do the same, to think about the indigenous peoples of your lands. I'd like to thank the Sydney Southeast Asia Center and the ANU Myanmar Center for hosting this event 1 year on from the military coup in Myanmar. What comes next? I'd like to say just before we start that we're going to speak a little bit, and then there will be opportunities for questions and answers from any of you, and you can post those in the Q&A, and you can post anonymously if you like. I know that there are many events in these coming days. There have been, and there will continue to be, about Myanmar. And we know that there are people from Myanmar currently living in Myanmar that are trying to access these events. We are sensitive to that and sensitive to the fact that you would want to be posting anonymously. The 1 year anniversary is not something that we consider in any way a celebratory event. We consider it an opportunity to think about what this year has meant for the people of Myanmar, how difficult it has been, and realistically, what we can expect moving forward. If you are present with us on Zoom today, you know some of the particulars already. You know that the tanks rolled in about a year ago, that arrests were made, sending people to prison, including our colleague and compatriot Sean Turnell, who remains in prison today. You know the protests that followed, the violence that ensued in response. You know the new alliances made among different opposition groups. You may know that the international and regional response has been paltry, to great bitterness within the country. Recently, a few multinational organizations have pulled out. But the intransigence of the military, the Tatmadaw, remains. The economy, the health, and the education systems are spiraling. And as of yesterday, estimates are that more than 1,500 have been killed and nearly 9,000 are in prison. That is the tiniest summary, because I really want to leave it to our illustrious speakers to speak more about that. So I want to introduce them and allow them to surmise on the question of where we go from here. Mo Thuzar is a fellow at the ICS, Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, where she co-coordinates the Myanmar Studies program. She was previously with the ICS's ASEAN Studies Center. She has been a steady and insightful commentator on Myanmar on so many of the webinars that I have attended this past year, including an excellent one yesterday at Deakin. And I am grateful to her for her thoughts today. Welcome, Mo Thuzar. David Dang Mo is originally from Mindat, Chin State in Myanmar, which is currently under martial law. He is a PhD candidate at Asbury Theological Seminary in the United States. He is the author of a book, Pitu Doka Theology, which was published in 2017, and has published over 70 scholarly articles, edited books in academic journals. He has also contributed a great deal of analysis about Burmese politics, religion, ethnicity, nationalism in academic centers, and popular audiences at Georgetown, University of Notre Dame, and even earlier today at Yale University. Nick Cheesman is a friend and a colleague. He's the associate professor at the Australian National University and the director of its Myanmar Research Center. He researches law, politics, and state violence, and in particular, a project now, a very interesting one on torture. His recent essay in the Arena Quarterly, Revolution in Myanmar, is available to read on his academia page. Excuse me, I've just read it, and it's riveting and very powerful. And Catherine Renshaw is a professor in the law school at Western Sydney University, where she teaches human rights law and international human rights law. Her research focuses on the Asia Pacific region. She is also a friend and colleague. I will say that my copy of her book, Human Rights and Participatory Politics in Southeast Asia, is dog-eared from my thumbing of it so many times. I'd like to welcome all of us, all of you to this important event. And I think I'd like to kick it off with some commentary by Mo Kizar. Mo, I was hoping you could just sketch for us for the past year what has happened, identifying the places and the players of the most importance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the kind introduction. I'd also like to thank the University of Sydney and the Australian National University, particularly the Sydney Southeast Asia Research Centre and the Myanmar Research Center at the ANU for hosting this important event on the sad occasion of the one-year mark of the military coup in Myanmar. My sentiments of sympathy and support also go to all the brave people in Myanmar living through this continuing nightmare that started a year ago. And our thoughts are also very much with our colleague Sean Turnell. Sean was actually writing his analysis of the economic reforms of the National League for Democracy government with us as a visiting fellow at ICS when the tragedy happened, and he was detained, and he remains under detention today. I'd like to spend the next 5 minutes or so by setting the context for our discussion this morning. And I'd like to tell that story quickly in a series of maps. Susan, you've set the context so excellently. I don't know what else I can add. So I think telling the story in a series of maps might add to that contextual introduction that you've given. So I'll start sharing the screen now. What you see on screen is basically the electoral map of the November 2020 general elections, and the coup on 1st February 2021 basically overturned the 2020 election results, in which the National League for Democracy, the NLD, had received a second mandate to continue with the democratic transition, imperfect as it was. So the military coup last year essentially reversed that democratic transition, deposing the democratically elected government. And this map shows that in the week of February 8th to February 17th, there was a nationwide uprising everywhere in the country against the coup, protesting against military rule. These are spontaneous protests mobilized and organized by the people, and it very much tracks the voting sentiment of the 2020 elections. This map was compiled by a young Kachin politician from the Shan Nationalities League for Democracy. He and his team have been tracking the coup resistance in the early days and months. Well, since last year, it's very clear that the military has not stopped its violence despite diplomatic overtures and engagement from regional groupings such as ASEAN to stop the violence and to bring about conditions conducive to dialogue. That window closed or became very, very narrow in a short amount of time, almost as soon as the military started using lethal force against civilian protesters. International diplomacy, as Susan has observed, has also been sluggish creating more cynicism and disappointment in Myanmar among the Myanmar people. And at the same time, the atrocities and the violence have also led to, I think, what we can all view as a new awakening and appreciation of how the various ethnic communities across the country have been subject to the military's disregard for human life and dignity. We will be hearing more about that from David Mole later on. And of course, the military's atrocities and continued violence also show the type of familiarity that and ease with which they always fall back into this institutionalized violence in the form of state terror and torture, which we'll be hearing more from Nick Cheeseman later this morning as well. Very quickly, this map shows the anti-coup demonstrations in Myanmar as at the end of June 2021, and we are already seeing the kind of the concentration where the clashes with the military have also spread into the Bamar heartlands, which hitherto had been largely, I would say, largely unaffected by the kind of structural violence that the military commits in its clashes with ethnic armed groups. This map also shows the situation at June 2021, the before and after, before the coup of IED explosions and after the coup as at June in townships where there had been at least one explosion or a mine or an improvised explosive device. So what does that cost? I think it has caused many communities across Myanmar to flee the conflict, and this map shows the displacements also as at mid-year, where you will see that the concentration of where people have been displaced, where communities have been affected the most, are again in the ethnic areas and those along the borders with either India or with Thailand and also with China. So basically 1 year later, what do we see? Communities across Myanmar do live in constant fear of conflict, and more have been displaced, as we've just seen. And junta atrocities have continued to escalate, provoking new cycles of violence, particularly after September 2021. And the ethnic areas have borne the brunt, even as clashes have moved into or spread into the Bamar heartland areas. This shows, again, another conflict heat map. And this shows the map of junta atrocities as at December 2021, tracking from July. And this really shows that what's happening in Myanmar sometimes may fade from international attention, but please look at how the toll in Myanmar is now surpassing that of countries that we normally associate with disaster, failure, and wholesale brutalities whenever we talk about clashes and civilian deaths. I'll stop sharing right now to just give a couple of wrapping up observations before we move into the more in-depth discussions. 1 year later, it's still very clear that the State Administration Council junta is willfully blind, impervious to the implications of their ill-thought-out coup. They are still recalcitrant to diplomatic pressure, which has also increased starting in the ASEAN context from the 15th of October last year. Never before has someone purporting to be the leader of an administrative entity in a member state of ASEAN, never before has been someone at that level being denied attendance at important key political meetings of ASEAN. And member states of ASEAN are continuing to hold that line as a collective decision, despite the variety of views and opinions that may exist within the grouping. I think on the ground, representing the people's sentiment broadly, loosely in a coalition, we see the parallel National Unity Government and also the National Unity Consultative Council aiming to present an inclusive and consultative platform for the federal future envisioned by many. But of course, at the same time, these entities are also dealing with the trust deficit and historical legacies in their attempt to reach out to as many of the ethnic groups and armed organizations as possible. I think in the foreign policy space, the SAC junta and the NUG are both seeking to contest that space on who is the legitimate representative of Myanmar. I think we'll be hearing more of that analysis from Catherine later on. But really, neither of these entities are in a satisfactory position, even though the SAC junta dominates the ASEAN space, still at working level sectoral meetings, even some ministerial meetings, and of course, still continues to dominate the Myanmar missions and embassies abroad. But the broad sentiment and support of the people are with the NUG and the NUCC as representative of the resistance movement. But who are in this resistance movement? It is the people of Myanmar, the brave, courageous people of Myanmar, whether they be the ethnic communities or the ethnic armed organizations in varying degrees of consultation and negotiation for that political future that is more inclusive and federal in nature. We have seen the creativity and courage of protesters, women and youth being at the fore of them. And of course, how those protests have also morphed now into the armed resistance since September onwards with the People's Defense Forces also taking up, I think, the decision to decide their own safety into their hands. This is what we're seeing. There are various political parties. None of them has yet been officially dissolved yet, and they are divided across the spectrum of mediation and resistance. And of course, there's also the civil society trying to fill the gap that has been left of humanitarian assistance and support, that social collective action necessary when systems and structures of government fail. And of course, internationally, the interest continues on how to limit and curtail the junta's movements and access to income and revenue, and to support the democracy movement. But crises are many, and it falls upon ASEAN, I think, to provide that sustained effort to deal with this internal challenge to the grouping, particularly to maintain its centrality and its credibility. But really, we are all caught in this downward spiral towards an unrelentingly bleak future where, Susan, you've highlighted, people are facing more plunging into poverty, and basically the cost of living in Myanmar, the daily economic life of the people is dire at best in the urban areas. I'll stop here. I apologize for going over time.
That was very powerful and important, and you a very good transition for David to speak about the broad general ethnic issue and specifically what is happening in his hometown. Thank you so much, David. We pass it over to you now with some sobriety.
Can you see my screen?
We can.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share a panel with these distinguished scholars as well as academic activists, I would call. Ethnically, I'm Chin, and regionally speaking, I'm from Mindat, which is now under martial law. So Mindat has been now the first town in the ethnic minority regions to be under martial law in the history of Myanmar.
David, can I interrupt you to ask you if
Myanmar
you're able to make this a slideshow just so it's easier to see? There's that little button on the bottom where you press for slideshow. That will make it easier for everyone to see.
Can you, sorry, like this?
Yep, there you go. Thank you. Keep going. I apologize.
Okay, sure, absolutely, that's fine. Thank you. So ethnically, I'm Chin, and I'm from Mindat. Burma or Myanmar is a country of both the ethnic majority groups and the ethnic minority group. But the ethnic minority groups have been feeling that they are aliens in their home country because the ethnic majority Burma group have been dominating the countries since the national independence in 1948. So since then, the ethnic minority group have been resisting against Burmanizations, which create the Burma majority groups privileges and ethnic minority discriminations. So they have been fighting against these Burmanizations for federal democracy for many, many years. So now it's 70 years. So that means they have been resisting the country for 70 years, even before the rise of this military coup. So when the new military coup happened, what is interesting thing is that both the majority groups and the minority groups come together and see themselves as one people, and they fight against the coup. This is something very impressive. Although we always think of reconciliations is about the reconciliation between the military government and Aung San Suu Kyi, or maybe the Tatmadaw and the ethnic minority armed group, but the reconciliation really happens among the non-state ordinary people because of this coup. So this is something we need to celebrate in the midst of so many challenges. So they resist the coup, coming together as one people of the Myanmar. And my hometown, Mindat, is the people in Mindat is one of the earliest ethnic groups to resist the coup with the hunting guns. Interestingly, not all the people in Chin State have these hunting guns actually. So interestingly, the people in my hometown, Mindat, have so many guns. So almost all the men has to hold this kind of hunting guns. So when the military coup used a violent crackdowns on the peaceful protesters, they took up some hunting guns and they fight against the coup. And they even use some knife and then some stones, those who don't have hunting guns. So they really feel that they have to defend themselves in that way, so no options. So here in the international community, sometimes we always feel that, well, the way people in Myanmar fighting for democracy is so violent. That might be true, but we have to understand the situations that the people begin in a non-violent way. But when the military government use of violent crackdowns, then the civilian use this kind of violent way as their last resort. That's something we should understand. So because of the people in Mindat strong resistance to the coup, Mindat has been under martial law since May 30th. So since Mindat has been put under martial law, many hometown people fled to jungles, or maybe the neighboring villages, or maybe the neighboring some smaller towns. They left their town. So what we could also see, the major issue among this ethnic minority group is that burning houses. Burning houses. You can see here the picture on the left side. The military government has recently burned hundreds of houses in Tan Drang, which is the northern part of Chin State. So my hometown is the southern part. So this is from the northern part. So they have burned down these hundreds of houses, including some churches. So they burned down these houses. This is the ethnic persecution that we should see. And also the second picture here is that the military government is burning some about 30 people alive on the 24th of December, just before the Christmas day. They burned these 30 people in the Karenni state. So as Motuza has highlighted earlier, the strong resistance really happens in the ethnic minority regions. So this is something important to highlight. And also recently, some of you might have seen the news that the Tatmadaw has slaughtered about 10 people in Matupi. So Matupi is my neighboring town, which is just 100 miles away from my hometown. I used to live in Matupi for 1 year actually. So Matupi is like my second town in Chin State. So they arrested 10 civilians, including a 13-year young man, and then they just slaughtered them. The way they kill is very brutal. They just use their hand in that way, and then they just cut here. So this is something really brutal. So I feel that it's not appropriate to show you the picture. So I didn't put the picture here, but it's really, really brutal. So because of this conflict, we can also see this humanitarian crisis in these ethnic minority regions, in Karen State and Karenni State, as well as in my home state of Chin. So because of this conflict, so they have two options. Some people fled to jungles, or some people fled to the neighboring countries. So the first picture on the right side shows that some Chin people, particularly the town that I showed you earlier, they fled to India to seek refuge there because it's not safe for them to live in their town anymore because the Tatmadaw has been burning down their houses. So they have no choice. so they fled to India to seek refuge. And the second picture on the right side is the IDP people in the current state. So I think I know that Nick is very expert in this current issue, so he might know this one. So these are the IDP people in the current state, those who fled to Thailand. So some Karenni and the people in current state fled to Thailand as their neighboring nations. Like for Chin people, they fled to India. Although the India government is not supportive of the democracy movement, as you might know. So the Indian government tends to stand in solidarity with this military government, but the civilians, the ordinary people, show their solidarity with the people in Chin state, and particularly like the Mizoram state. So they welcome them and they let them stay in their house. So now thousands of Chin people live in Mizoram state as a refugee. So
David, I just wanted to say, if you can wrap it up in the next minute, that would be great. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Sure, absolutely fine. And then the other challenge here we have is the airstrike, using the airstrike in the ethnic minority regions, because this Tatmadaw also feel that they cannot win this ethnic group on the ground, so they use the airstrike so that they want to destroy every town, every city, and all the people. And also, what I fear is that there could also be the divide and rule in our state. So you can see here, ZRA and CDF, although these local defense are fighting for freedom, but ZRA is trying to fight against their own, this CDF, the Chinland Defense Force people, instead of fighting against the military coup, but they are fighting against their own people. So I feel that the military might use this kind of things as kind of like divide and rule. I fear the future of Chin state in that way. So let me conclude my talk today. So my question here is, do the ethnic minorities and ethnic majorities share the same vision beyond the coup? I think that the answer is absolutely yes. But the ethnic minorities share additional visions that getting freedom from the coup is not enough for them. They want to get freedom from these Buddhist nationalisms and these Burmanizations, so that they could really have a more peaceful and a more harmonious existence in the future of Myanmar. So let me conclude. I think in order to remember this 1 year of anniversary, I would like to conclude this with 3 C's: courage. The people in Myanmar are so courageous. They are really brave. The second is the way they resist the coup is very creative, even beyond the prediction of the military government themselves. Very, very creative. I think one of the most creative democracy movement in the human history, perhaps. It's very creative. The third is that the people are very compassionate to one another as the victims. So because of these 3 C's, that this democracy movement in Myanmar will still go on. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for that very powerful presentation, and with a slightly, I wouldn't say hopeful conclusion, but at least we've got the 3 C's to think about. Nick, how have the dimensions of the violence that Mo and David have described played out in the political arena?
Thank you very much, Susan, for that question. So it's tough to follow David, having heard all of that he's had to say, but let me try and do that, reflecting a little bit also on what Mo remarked on, with her maps still very much in my mind, and put forward 2 observations that may be helpful for us, that may also set a slightly different tone from what we've had thus far. And I'll conclude with a question that I myself have tentative answers to, but I'm not going to have time to explore them here, but we'll be happy to take them up for discussion afterwards. The first observation, which really is an obvious observation, is that the army's problem, the Myanmar army's problem right now, is that it's not being obeyed by civilians. Now, nobody expected, nobody except for the utterly delusional perhaps would expect that the coup would get any kind of civilian support, and indeed the army for the most part didn't look to it. But what it does need is obedience, secured of course through the kind of, in the first instance, terrorization that we've seen into 2021, and then the usual arrangements to dominate and to demoralize the population, to wear it down and humiliate. And that anyway is what we saw in the 1990s and 2000s. But it's not working now. As we saw again with yesterday's silent strike, people across the length and breadth of Myanmar are neither obeying the orders of the army, and this is critical really, nor are they acting as if they are. The army needs that appearance of compliance in order to obtain some type of control on the situation, and it's just not getting it. And it's much more than the CDM movement, although that, of course, is a very significant part of this. It's a generalized condition of disobedience. So soldiers have lost their ability to order civilians, to get them to obey, and I don't see how they're going to get it back, certainly not at this point. The second observation that follows from the first is that if obedience for the military is critical but no longer possible, then the idea and practice of revolution, and revolution really in a new sense of the term, becomes viable. And this isn't to say that the revolution is likely to succeed or not, to go about trying to determine the likelihood of outcomes or to stake odds one way or the other. I think that kind of activity right now is pointless. I think to ask questions about whether or not the revolution might succeed right now is actually to completely miss the point. Revolutions succeed unexpectedly. That is the character of revolutions. What people don't expect to happen, happens. So equally, if we sit around then, thinking about likelihood of outcomes and, for instance, try to count up the number of Russian helicopters that the army has purchased to strike against the people in Chin State that David was just referring to, his compatriots, family members and friends, or for that matter, people in Sagaing or Magui or Mandalay regions, then I think we're completely missing the point. This isn't to say that this stuff is irrelevant. Of course, as we just heard from David, and as we heard from Mo already, it matters greatly for the people in those situations who are being targeted by the military through the atrocious use of violence. But the point, rather, is that we get the wrong end of the stick of the revolutionary moment if we go around the place just trying to grab hold of and count up all of those materials associated with the violence. We miss the point about the viability of revolution, the possibility of this moment and what it represents 1 year on from the military coup. And in that regard, I think, and this is then to get to the implication and the question that I have for everyone, but especially for the likes of Catherine and me, people who are not Myanmar nationals, but who've been interested in, and Susan, yourself, who've been interested in and working on Myanmar for many years. That's that if disobedience is what made the revolution viable at the outset, then the other element that's made it viable subsequently is armed revolutionary violence. And here I don't mean to say, as some people would insist, that violence is necessary in all revolutionary situations. We see many situations where it's not. And I don't mean to in any way downplay the importance of the role of nonviolence in this revolutionary moment. The colleague here at the ANU, George Lawson, who's written eloquently on the relationship between nonviolence and violence in revolutionary moments. But rather the point is that in this particular case, for the revolution to be thinkable and therefore for it to be viable, it had to have, from my point of view, a revolutionary armed violence component. Now, if it had to have that component, then I think the problem for the likes of Susan, you, Catherine, and me, and to a lesser extent, I think our colleagues like David and Mo, is how do we come to terms with that? And I think it's a genuine problem for us because, well, on the one hand, we would all agree that we're in support in general terms of this revolutionary moment. Actually, in many ways, we don't really know what to do and say about revolutionary violence. Decades of non-revolutionary conditions in the West, let's say, in the Anglophone world, in Australia, a settler colony that has been counter-revolutionary for its entire history and continues to be, coupled with the neoliberal moment that we're in presently, the end of the nationalist wars of liberation of the colonial world and the decline of Marxism, the persuasive force of non-violent movements in the last few decades that have been tremendously successful have all in some way kind of disarmed us intellectually and politically when it comes to engaging with revolutionary violence of the sort that I'm seeing in Myanmar, that we're all seeing in Myanmar right now. So I think our question then and our task is how do we recover the resources that we need to give this armed revolutionary violence its due? How do we take it seriously and engage with it on its own terms? That's the task that the people who are fighting in Myanmar against dictatorship today, both through violent and non-violent actions, have set for us. That's the task that really matters from my point of view, more than any other, politically and intellectually at this juncture. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for an extremely powerful talk asking some very hard questions for those of us that have been disarmed. I like your use of the word there. I think part of that answer could indeed come from Catherine right now when we think about what the less powerful elements of the international community have done and what they've been willing to do and what they could do going forward. So Catherine, very eager to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks to ANU and the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre for letting us remember this anniversary, and I share everyone's distress about just what it signifies. Nick, just to follow straight on from your point, there are very, very good reasons why so much energy has been directed over the past decades away from armed revolution as an answer to political crisis. And it's because we know the deep levels of suffering, most importantly on women and children, that revolution entails. And that's why the whole UN project is directed towards peaceful transition in every possible circumstance. So I think we can't allow ourselves to become disillusioned to the extent that we take the possibilities for ending this conflict peacefully and diplomatically and politically without violence off the table. That said, we need to stare the massive failures of the international community in the face right now. So in June, we had a powerful statement, a resolution from the UN General Assembly declaring that what happened on February the 1st, 2021 was an illegal seizure of power, that the flow of arms to the generals must stop. It's of course not binding because it's just from the General Assembly. From the UN Security Council, we haven't had anything from the Security Council that would stop the flow of arms into Myanmar. Indeed, 2 of the permanent members are supplying arms to the generals, and we haven't had a global united sanctions regime against Myanmar either. The third sort of legal international front has been the recognition of the National Unity Government, and Mo referred to that earlier. So that's been a legal battle where the National Unity Government has sought to hold the seat in the United Nations General Assembly as the legitimate representative of the people of Myanmar. And that's become a proxy war, if you like, that is not resolved yet. And the arguments are pretty important for us to think about if you're interested in just the international law questions. They are who has control of the country, and you look at, well, who's holding the capital, and you look at who controls the infrastructure, who controls the ports, and you could make a strong argument, as David and Nick have, that right now the military is not in practical control of most of Myanmar. And then you would turn to the question of legitimacy, and Mo has answered that conclusively for us. It's the National Unity Government that represents the legitimate aspirations of the people of Myanmar. And then a final question, which lawyers are focusing on right now, which is, well, which of the 2 contending parties is best placed to serve the purposes and principles of the United Nations and its charter, which is peace and security? Who can deliver on that? Is it the National Unity Government or is it the SAC? And the answer to that is more complicated, because you would have to think that it's the SAC that needs to desist in its violence against the people of Myanmar. So that battle's going on. And the other important thing internationally is the raft of international legal proceedings involving Myanmar, first involving the Rohingya genocide question in the International Court of Justice. And in terms of resolving the present conflict, we can expect zero help whatsoever from those proceedings, which will drag on for more than a decade. They're still in the preliminary stage. We can look at the International Criminal Court. The National Unity Government has declared that the ICC has jurisdiction over crimes committed within Myanmar, but again, with little chance of actually having any generals before the court. Then there's no hope from the ICC right now. And we have a raft of universal jurisdiction prosecutions going on in Argentina and elsewhere. And again, without being able to secure the military actually in court. We can't expect them to have a tangible impact on what's going on in Myanmar on the ground. ASEAN, which Mo mentioned, is, I think, at the centre of any prospect for peaceful resolution, but those prospects are dim indeed. So the signal achievement of ASEAN was the 5-point consensus, which hasn't got off the ground yet. It was notable, as Mo said, that ASEAN didn't have Min Aung Hlaing attend the ASEAN summit, but just how notable is that really, given that he's been accused of committing genocide, and to have a genocidaire attending an ASEAN summit would have been an outrage. So it was a small victory, but nonetheless notable. And finally, on the international sphere, Susan mentioned that we have major companies like Total and Chevron finally pulling out of Myanmar. And the cynics have also noted that the gas fields are almost empty anyway. Their work in Myanmar was drawing to a close, and it wasn't such a great loss for them to pull out of Myanmar. So where do we have the role of international actors then in the crisis? And I've noted the strong comments over the last couple of days that the answer to this is going to be found on the ground in Myanmar, in the towns and the cities where actual fighting's being carried out. And from Nick just now, that we should keep in our minds the possibility of revolutionary violence as an outcome, a successful revolution here. I think that we need to keep at the forefront of our minds every possible option for an off-ramp for the generals in these circumstances. And that's because every day that the violence goes on, it deepens, and the possibilities of peaceful resolution become further distant for everyone. And David spoke about the violence that's used and the defensive violence that's necessary when a peaceful people are being confronted by soldiers from their own army. But we should acknowledge that that's not the only sort of violence that's going on in Myanmar right now as well, that the People's Defence Force are targeting civilians. They're carrying out assassinations as well. And that if there is a retribution at the end of this, both sides will have to answer to that. And finally, just to conclude before questions, if we are thinking about pre-transitional justice, so what needs to be in place before a genuine transition or resolution can take place, then we need to return to the question of truth. So before 2012, the argument was made strongly by Aung San Suu Kyi and people who had thought deeply about Myanmar for many years, most of them Burmese, was that we might be able to do without retribution. We don't necessarily need prosecutions, but we need a form of truth-telling to make genuine transition work. We need acknowledgement of what happened, and we need that to form a break with the past. And as we all know, that didn't happen. That the United Nations and the US and other actors were happy for transition to proceed without any telling of the truth, which has allowed in these tragic circumstances for the military to revert to its barbaric practices of torturing and killing its own people.
Thank you so much for just a really powerful set of talks. Rather than me saying anything else right now, what I thought I might do is just read the questions that cannot be answered by putting a link in the chat. I'm going to read a series of them, actually. Encourage the audience to put any additional questions in, but allow you to kind of jump in as you see fit. From Roxmi Him in Cambodia, the questions are, when do you think is the right time to have political dialogues with all parties in Myanmar, especially between the Tatmadaw, NUG, and ethnic armed organizations? Why hasn't the junta dissolved the NLD? Is it true that there are two groups of NLD, the one that favors NUG and the other one who is believed to continue to favor working peacefully with the junta. The next question I'd like to highlight for now is from Banya Hangsar, which is specifically to Sayama Motuzar. Do you hope that EEO's leaders will be leaving their faith to NUG CRPH in the next 300 days, or maybe playing wait and see games with the SAC? Thank you. That could actually go to all participants. The next one is from Elliot Press Freeman. Why do we think that the NUG represents the legitimate interests of the Myanmar people? Underclass activists in Myanmar report frustration with what they perceive as corruption and inefficiency from the NUG. So this is a presupposition that needs to be contested. And we have, I'm going to just add one more for now, and then we'll do another round. From an anonymous attendee, what would be the best way to solve the current problem in Myanmar? How do you understand PDF's killing on unarmed civilians with the accusation of military informers? I think the best person to start with, particularly those first couple of questions, is Mo and David, and we can I'd like all the participants to jump in. Thanks.
Okay, let me take a stab at it. Well, first to Raxmi, I think, you know, this is the main challenge that those in the international and regional community have in trying to you know, do that kind of quote unquote shuttle diplomacy among key stakeholders to identify when, you know, as you have mentioned, would be a right time to have political dialogue. The sentiments on the ground right now are so much against, you know, seeing any representative entity for the will of the people sitting down at a table to talk to people, as Catherine has highlighted, who have blood on their hands, who are genociders. So the important thing is anybody who is interested to try and bring out a constructive outcome to this tragedy in Myanmar needs to really start looking at what their job is in consulting all key stakeholders. And when I talk about key stakeholders, it's not just the military as the sole interlocutor. We need to know what are the interests of not just the NUG as well, but the ethnic armed groups, and especially those that have started also participating and contributing to the National Unity Consultative Council discussions that are trying to, at the same time, formulate state level federal arrangements and charters and so on. So it is complex, but I think it is the duty and responsibility of anybody who is undertaking any form of shuttle diplomacy or mediation undertaking to really start talking to these important interests that come on, that are, you know, that have really their stake in the future. And I think that to a certain extent might also address Eliot's important observation about the NUG being representative of the legitimate interests of the Myanmar people. I think the reference there to NUG being that representative is a broad reference for the time being, regardless of fragmentation of interest, of dissatisfaction. I think there is this understanding that you know, the NUG is somehow the representative entity if it comes to international interlocution. But at the same time, this is why platforms like the National Unity Consultative Council, which has just convened its first People's Assembly on January the 27th, by the way. It's why the NUCC platform is also very important to really hear these voices and frustrations. I think what we're trying to, what we're seeing here, of course, is that not to have a repeat of quote unquote, we know best type of attitudes and sentiments from a party that has won the elections, which is why I observed that the democratic transition, imperfect as it were, was all that we had to raise voice and accountability issues. And I think it's important, even during the time of resistance and revolution, to also raise those voice and accountability issues, so that the feedback there is that continuous feedback loop given to entities such as the NUG and, of course, at a broader level, the NUCC on the concerns. It's not going to be easy. We've all heard from the NUCC press conference in November last year that they operate on the basis of consensus. We know what consensus is looking at ASEAN, but the fact that they are trying to get things right by seeking agreement before moving on a decision, I think, is really important when we look at the NUCC. And I think that might also address aspects of what Bobanya Hongsa has talked about, EAO leaders leaving their faith to NUG CRPH. I don't think they are leaving their faith completely, 100%. There is the National Unity Consultative Consultative Council, in which the NUG and the CRPH are companion participants, as well as being a companion parallel structures. And that's important, that dialogue is going on, that consultation is going on, so that whatever is being done right now is also presenting a much more inclusive and broader vision beyond the SACs, and may I even say the NLD's more narrow visions.
Thank you, Mo. I'm mindful we only have 9 minutes left, so I'm going to pass it on to David, Nick, and then Catherine. I know that's unsatisfactory, but I leave you to read the screens yourself and answer what is useful for you. Yeah, thanks. David, are you comfortable speaking next? The questions that came out that I thought were more specific for you were about the ethnic armed groups. Are you okay to talk now?
I don't think I have much to say about it, because Mamo has said it enough. So that, I mean, to answer in a short way, I think it's not easy at this point. It's not easy at this point. So I don't think there will be a dialogue among those people in the near future. It's not easy, unless the Tatmadaw has fulfilled at least one of the 5 consensus given by ASEAN, at least one. If they don't fulfill even one, I don't think the dialogue will happen. So at least if they fulfill one, then the dialogue might come a little bit slightly easier. So that might be my short answer.
Okay, thank you. Nick, and would you like to jump in?
Thanks, Susan. Actually, if I can, I want to respond to Catherine's remark, as you might expect, in response to my comments, because it's good that that she gave that answer. But I don't think it is an answer. And I don't think it's a political position. And it goes exactly to my point that right now we lack the resources to say and respond to the conditions that we're confronting. This position of, well, there's a general problem with violence, which is now somehow sort of vaguely disambiguous and amorphous, and therefore all violence has to be opposed as a matter of principle, is a non-political position. That's precisely the problem with the humanitarian project, which has been critiqued now very well by the likes of Didier Fassin and others. It actually evacuates the possibility of a political position being taken. Now, I'm not saying to anyone, like, take a position this way or that way, but what I'm saying is that we lack the resources not to explain, or we do too much work to try and explain what we're encountering. What we're doing is we're lacking the resources to evaluate and to take a position which is both principled and thought through. And instead, it's either that default position, or it's like, well, tacitly, I will support armed violence, but I can't say so publicly because I'll be told that that's wrong as a matter of principle, and therefore I withdraw judgment. And I just think that's completely unacceptable, and that the situation that we encounter right now now is in Myanmar is one in which we do have a responsibility to think harder than that. The problem is not essentially one of suffering. I'm against that idea. Suffering evacuates the possibility of thinking politically. It's a non-political position. As David, you were going to the text that he wrote, Bitu Doka. Doka is the human condition, right? If the human condition is the problem, then that is not a political problem. The problem is injustice. And how do people in Myanmar respond to injustice? That's what we have to engage with. And we need other terms and other ways of thinking. We need to rearm ourselves intellectually and politically as scholars and people working on Myanmar.
I do want to just jump in for a moment, if I can take the chair's prerogative to say I'm grateful for that position, but I also want to give some credit to ANU for being in the past a place where those resources were available and given to scholars to say I have been at Myanmar Center seminars where scholars said, I can see why violence is happening. So you are hard on yourself where, I mean, the people we need to be the most kind to right now are the Myanmar people. There are scholars that are courageous enough to take that stand. But I think it can be said again and again. Catherine?
I don't think I could sit safely in Canberra and talk about violence happening elsewhere very comfortably at all. But just to return to my thesis about pre-transitional justice, one of the things that we're looking for right now, if the revolution is to be successful, is can we fracture the military? Can we get enough people leaving the military? Can we cause the unity of the Tatmadaw to divide? And one way that we could do that is to offer an amnesty for truth-telling to members of the military. A really good question came up in the chat. How can we ever ask people who have been victims of torture and rape to sit down at the negotiating table with their perpetrators? And I mean, the answer to that is that it's bitterly unjust and unfair, and we can't ask people to do that. And yet there we are, we're asking them to do that yet again. And there's small comfort in truth, but from the experiences of other peaceful transitions around the world, truth is an answer when violence isn't sometimes.
There are about 10 excellent questions, and I feel quite frustrated that we will not get to all of them. What I would like to do is ask the participants for like 10 seconds where we'll have the uncomfortable silence of having our panelists just read through them and pick the one they would like to answer, because I think that's the best way to go about this.
I was going to type a response to Ian's comment, so while the others are reading through, I'll just say it's the wrong button by accident. I concur with his comments at 12:53, but my point is not one of justification. I'm not in a search for justification. I'm in a search for a position from which we can think and talk intelligently and in ways that don't compel us to adopt positions that aren't thought through. In other words, a position of political judgment.
There are some great questions about the about Facebook, about sanctions. So I really leave it to you reading through those to jump in. I think that's the best use of our time. While that's happening, I'm going to be cutting and pasting into the Q&A some of the questions that have been asked about some of Motudar's links. So I'll put that in the chat as well. Anyone? I didn't count on uncomfortable silence. But the questions are so good that I can see that. Edgar Rodriguez has talked about the weak regional responses. I think Mo has kind of answered that implicitly. A very broad theoretical question about the motivations of the junta that requires political power. Questions about sanctions and statements by Roger Lee Huang.
So many.
Go ahead, David. I'm going to just close it up in 1 minute, but I'd like to have maybe just 30 seconds remaining
Sure.
from each participant. David, would you like to go first?
Yes, there are so many good questions. I don't know, it's not enough time to answer. But what I could add on the existence of this violent BDF is that we could also know the philosophy in Myanmar. The Tatmadaw normally feel the person who have power with this kind of violent, this armed group. Like for example, they feel this Wa ethnic group, for example, because they have a strong that kind of weapons, all these things. That might also be one of the philosophy behind the existence of this BDF, that the Tatmadaw will feel them and they will come and negotiate and surrender. So that might also be one of the hidden philosophy behind this, the violent, the existence of the violent BDF. That could also be the philosophy. Let me add it that way.
Thank you. And then I think we'll just have a conclusion from Mo, and then I'll just say a few last words and we'll close up just 1 or 2 minutes late. I apologize to our participants. Go ahead, Mo.
Well, any conversation on the situation of what's happening in Myanmar, can go on and on and on, because there are so many different aspects and interesting dimensions of the tragedy that's happening in the country. But I think it's important, and building on David's point here, about we need to be really clear-eyed about who started the violence, who are the perpetrators of it, and therefore, the response to it that has now spiraled into this, cycle of violent action reaction kind of situation. So again, in a closed door discussion yesterday, I brought up this observation, which I think I will leave the audience with. People in Myanmar have this, I think, saying, this attitude when times are really desperate, when they are in despair and the situation is bleak and dire. There's this kind of thinking that comes to people's minds about, in Burmese, it's maturobu, which means nothing matters anymore.
Yeah.
And if the mindset of the people in Myanmar is nothing matters anymore, but they have to really take whatever means they can do to create that future that they want, that's what we're seeing happen. And that's what the community in the region and in the international arena need to understand in considering channels and programs of support for the country and the people.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for that heartfelt conclusion. I think the only words that I have to say after that is that I am putting in the chat 2 different links. One is a link that is a statement put out by the ANU Myanmar Research Center 1 year after the coup. And the second is a petition that can be signed. It is not sponsored by any sort of organization, to free Sean Turnell. I'm only left to thank our speakers. We know there's a lot out there at this 1 year anniversary, but it is always important to continue to be having this conversation. I know that it is emotionally taxing, particularly on our colleagues from Myanmar, and I express the best that I can, which is my solidarity with you. And the hope that these calls for more thinking resources and advocacy resources and emotional resources will mean that in 1 year, this is not the webinar that we are holding again. So I thank you to all of you and to our participants for a number of very, very good questions. And I think at this point we say goodbye.